If you don't mind signing in right here. Thank you, sir.
I gotcha. You can go ahead. Oh, hey, Drew. Go on down. I'll sign you up.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Good morning. My name is Lee Pazzi, and I direct the California program at the New America Foundation,
You got
a
two of
nonpartisan
these.
think tank based in Washington, D.C., and here in Sacramento. We're delighted that you've joined us today, both in person and on our webcast, for this presentation, brainstorming session, and update on political reform in California, which we called originally California version 2.0. Last week, a clip of tornado nation pursuing an especially monstrous storm was getting an extended play on cable networks, often side by side with segments of the California financial crisis. The two clips together seemed to be a natural fit. They suggested that what is somehow needed for California governance is not simply changes to day-to-day weather patterns, but to the proverbial jet stream itself, the rules that structure the state's governance and electoral process. This would probably begin with the unwieldy state constitution, which has been amended some 512 times since 1879, but never overhauled. Those of you here today, and increasingly many citizens around the state, as suggested both by polls and everyday conversations, know that a muddled approach is unlikely to succeed. The recession has taken California's permanent low-grade budget fever, worsened by the double two-thirds supermajority rules, and turned it into a life-threatening illness. No one knows to this point which particular reforms or combinations of reforms will be necessary to fix the state's paralysis, but many promising and comprehensive approaches are well underway. What we intend to do today is to have a serious and candid discussion on the nuts and bolts details of these approaches and the mechanics of a potential constitutional convention in particular, and to reserve the maximum amount of time for audience participation. In February here in Sacramento, many of you participated in a major event organized by the Bay Area Council to explore a possible constitutional convention. After the results of last month's special elections deepened the state's impasse, the council and other groups put forward two ballot initiatives aimed at putting a convention on the November 2010 ballot. John Grubb, the senior vice president of the council, is here today to bring us up to date on recent developments and discuss where this initiative goes from here. The deepening crisis has made the impetus behind California Forward, the political and fiscal reform organization founded in 2007 through the combined efforts of 5 major California foundations, even more critical and pertinent now. California Forward has called for a variety of comprehensive budgeting reforms, played a key role in the passage of Prop 11 last fall's redistricting initiative, and has raised the idea of creating a leaner and more efficient state government by moving the tax collecting authority and management of programs to local governments. We're very pleased to have Fred Silva, California Forward's senior fiscal policy advisor, with us today to discuss these major initiatives and to preview the way ahead. The legal and political challenges to constitutional and electoral reform have only begun to get their moment in the spotlight. And to complete the first panel, we're honored to have two of the state's leading experts on these questions, Thad Kusser, a professor of political science at the University of California, San Diego, and James Harrison, a partner at Remcho, Johansson, and Purcell, to explain these issues to us. And all their bios are available at the side and at the back. And finally, a number of my colleagues at New America have been thinking and writing often about the ways the structure of California government and California elections could be changed significantly, in particular to re-engage an increasingly diverse public in the daily work of democracy. Our second panel will link process to substance and feature Mark Paul, senior scholar at New America, Stephen Hill, director of the California-based National Political Reform Program at New America Foundation, and Tomas Jimenez, assistant professor of sociology at Stanford University and an Irvine fellow at New America, to describe these big ideas in the context of today's reform discussion. I want to give special thanks to the James Irvine Foundation for making today's event possible, and to call on Michael Weinberg, New America's Senior Research Fellow and frequent writer on political reform, to moderate and introduce the first panel.
I think that
We'll just go ahead and kick things off because we've got a lot of exciting people to hear about and to hear from, including yourselves. So first I'd like to turn it over to Fred Silva, who, as Leif mentioned, is the Senior Fiscal Policy Advisor for California Forward. Fred?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Leif. I'm going to do a little of the nuts and bolts side of this to give you some perspective about governance and fiscal reform. Some of these things you may think are nuts, and hopefully some of those things you'll think are bolts. But what I'm going to try to do is to provide a backdrop for this discussion about which way we go. At root, this is all about a balance of power. And whether you think it's the 2/3 vote requirement or whether you think it's the ability of a city to levy the sales tax, at root, it's fundamentally about the balance of power between state government and its subordinate governments, counties and cities, and our regions in California. We had a model of this invented back in 1910 called the separation of sources. And the idea was that the entity that levies the tax ought to spend the money and to be obligated for that. And so the state, back in 1910, after about 25 years of angst over that balance between state and local power, thought state taxes should be used for state purposes and local taxes ought to be used for local purposes. That was a model we had for a long period of time. Some of you who have studied that know that this great growth in California, in part infrastructure, in part financed post-World War II, most of that investment came out from community governments, not from state government. All right? So we roll the clock forward and we look at the late 70s. We know what happened in actually the 70s and early 80s, both before and after Prop 13. And the challenge for all of us is to think at root, what's the issue here? And California Forward's view is two parts. One of them is it really is about understanding the balance between community obligations, and when I say community or I say local government, many of you in the hall, because this is a company town, go, oh, local government, those are cities and counties. And you think, that's not schools. Schools are schools. Schools are school districts. So cities and counties are local government, and schools are something else. They're school districts, and they have funding mechanisms and whatnot. Our view is that community governments are community governments, and they involve questions about education, they involve questions of municipal services, they involve questions of health and human service delivery. So our view is to look at these models and think, how is it that we could go back to this sort of separation of sources notion, that states have an underlying obligation and have a resource for that obligation, and that community governments, remember I said community governments, I didn't say schools or cities or counties, I said community governments, that they have an obligation and a resource base in order to implement that. And if you want to think about what's California Forward trying to do, that's at root what California Forward is headed toward. Now, many of you have seen both on our website at caforward.org, the work that we've been doing on the state budget process. We thought that that was an area that we ought to start with to look at. We have not finished the work on this notion of what the balance of that power should be. So many of you may think, well, gee, what's California Forward think about that? We're not quite there yet, but we're close. We've carried on a dialogue at the community and regional level over the last year to a year and a half to work with people who are interested in this. Believe it or not, you all are a company town. You fill the hall. We can fill a hall like this in Fresno. We can fill a hall like this in San Jose. We've done it. And those discussions tend to be with business people and people with community interests who are frustrated with this current balance of power and the current state's fiscal system. So we've suggested, as a footnote with respect to that balance of power, that the state budgeting process needs to change. It needs to be more multi-year oriented. It needs a new format in the form of performance measurement. It needs some form of a so-called pay-go model so that new programs get financed, whether it's by the legislature and governor and the initiative process. So there's some fiscal changes that need to be made as well. So over the next several months, you'll see more and more dialogue and discussion and more detail about what this balance of power ought to be. Keep in your peripheral vision the Commission on the 21st Century Economy, because they're talking about a new state tax model, not necessarily this balance of tax power, but rather a state tax model. So keep your eye on those. But the choice for all of us on whatever road we go down with respect to the fundamentals of reform and which road we take, to think about this question, this issue as a balance of power. Don't think about it simply as, gee, what should we do with the 2/3 vote requirement for the budget? Maybe it should be 55%, or maybe it should be 52%. don't think about that. Think about what the governance structure and the finance structure ought to be in California with respect to the underlying obligations of both the state and the underlying obligations of community government. So that's our message. Our timeline says we want to get more of this into the public domain and the public debate in the summer, and we're kind of here. So the legislature will have a forum, as we understand it, in July to work through some of this. We'll continue with our civic engagement. We hope to have measures that are ready for a ballot in 2010, either through the legislature, which we're prepared to do, or through the alternate process, which we're also prepared to do. So that's basically where we are. For those of you who are work in this community town, you go, never happened, I would submit to you that it's far better to be an optimist and accused a fool than a pessimist and be right.
Thank you so much, Fred. I'd like to say, for those of you who are standing in the back, I believe that we still have a few chairs here in the front. If you're sitting next to an open chair, could you raise your hand? Come on up for those of you who aren't averse to sitting in the front. All right. Well, Fred, that was a very exciting kickoff to the day, and I'd like to call up John Grubb, the Senior Vice President of the Bay Area Council, to keep us going.
What a turnout. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And thanks to the New America Foundation for all of your work and support and what's been happening in our state and what we're all trying to do through various reform efforts. The Bay Area Council, just to tell you quickly about us, we're a little bit more than 60 years old, business organization from the San Francisco Silicon Valley Bay Area. CEOs are our members. And we work on public policy issues that often require Sacramento to partner with us. One of our first projects was actually the BART system. They conceived of this and then came to Sacramento, got the enabling legislation written, and then did a campaign to support BART. We also work on water, energy, all the different public policy things that you think a business group should be working on. We brought a group of CEOs up to Sacramento last year in August, and we did it in August because we thought the budget would be done, and we could, that's a punchline. We thought that we could work on the hot bills at the time, on a water bill and an education bill, et cetera. Well, you know what last year was like. And we had a sort of parade of legislators coming in, looking a little bit dog-faced, basically saying that we can't work on these other bills until we finish the budget, and at that time they weren't even negotiating the budget. And so at the time, Assemblymember Mark DeSaulnier came in, and sort of as a joke that he'd heard from Don Parada, who was the president of the Senate at the time, in the elevator, he said, you know, maybe it's time we call a constitutional convention. And everyone sort of nervously laughed about it. And then the day ended, and we asked our members what they thought we should do after this meeting, and they said, why don't you look into this constitutional convention idea? So we did. We did some real basic research, and we wrote an op-ed in the San Francisco Chronicle called "This Government Has Failed Us." And it was very different than the normal op-ed experience. Usually, my mother calls me and says, good job, and maybe a couple other people, right? But instead, we heard from hundreds of people. We heard from ex-governors, we heard from the highest level of our current government system, from people all across the state, et cetera. So we realized we really had a tiger by the tail. And it's not very surprising that people are upset right now. Our education system, it's been ranked twice in the past 2 months as the 50th worst and 49th worst in the country. And I have a daughter who's 4 years old who's about to go into that system. We have a water system that's been in crisis for about 30 years. And if any of you have been following the media, you know that anybody goes there to try and speak about any other topic in Fresno, right now they get taken over by people who are concerned about water. Our healthcare crisis was supposed to be addressed, I believe it was in 2007. It was a year of healthcare reform. Didn't go anywhere. 2008, by the way, was supposed to be the year of education reform. Didn't happen. Our prisons are in the hands of a federal judge right now who is continually threatening the state and our leaders. We have some serious crises nearly everywhere you look, and of course one of the most obvious ones is going on right now, which is our budget process. It's not working. So there's this old line when you get to this place where they say, throw the bums out. But if you throw these bums out, the next set of bums are going to have the same set of problems. Now, and we don't think legislators are bums, by the way. Well, we think they're very well-intentioned people who are just as frustrated with the system themselves. And as a matter of fact, they tell us that quite a bit. There's another piece here about our broken system, which is that if you look at the approval ratings of the legislators right now, it's between, I even heard 7%, but basically between 7 and 15%. And the governor is not much above that. And you have to question if we can actually have a representative democracy when we have that little faith in our leadership. So I guess there isn't really a question, at least in our mind, of talking about do we need reform. The question is how do we get it? And so when our organization looked at this, we see that there's basically 3 routes. There's typically 2, but we think we found a sort of trap door here to reform. So the first 2 are, of course, to go through the legislature right now. And we really hope that that happens. And if the legislature can reform itself right now, working with California Forward, who we completely support and is doing great work through the legislature, if that can happen, then maybe we can just stop this constitutional convention push. We're a little bit skeptical, having learned from history, so let's see what happens there. The next route is through the initiative process. California operates under a single subject rule. So if you want to have the reforms that we're talking about, you need to have props A, B, C, D, all the way to Z. And imagine, a ballot prop usually costs somewhere around $30 million with signature gathering and the campaign you need to put behind it. That's pretty expensive. It would be really easy for special interest groups to pick that sort of a campaign off. And we think that voters might be a little frustrated being asked to vote on A through Z. So this trapdoor that we found, I think, it's called the Constitutional Convention. Our proposal, I won't go into too many details because I don't have a lot of time right now, but is to gather a group of citizens. We're proposing to do this by a sort of grand jury pool, or jury pool, you pick the term. But basically it's 5 people, voters or having a driver's license in each assembly district. That's 800 people, or excuse me, that's 400 people gathered together. And then we would present in 4 topic areas with the state's best experts and present to them the different options on budget reform, on the state-local relationship, which is absolutely key, as Fred was just talking about, on a new government oversight mechanism, and also on the election process, so how legislators are elected, and then also on the initiative process itself. And we can get into more detail on that if you would like to later on. But those are our 4 categories of reform. How do we get those? Is a great question. So we've had hundreds of meetings now with hundreds of people around the state, and that's what we've heard. Those are the 4 areas to focus on. We're doing town hall meetings across the state, several in Los Angeles, Fresno, the Bay Area. I won't go through the parade of places, but you know that there's a lot in California. We intend to be there. And we also have this website, our shameless plug, is repaircalifornia.org or .com. And people can have their own town hall meetings there. And hundreds of people have already done this, and they're submitting their reforms to us. So we're trying to coalesce all of this information into some ballot measures that we are going to submit. September 25 is our deadline of this year in order to qualify for the November 2010 ballot. Now the vote will be before you, the people. And a quick word about that selection process for delegates. The most important concern is how do you keep this thing from being gamed? And we think that is the best way, is to get people in the convention who owe nothing to anybody for them being there. So no one paid for their campaign. They got there, they have a mission, which is to reform the state, and we think that's a very powerful tool. Anyway, I'll stop with that. Basically, we would love to hear what you think should be the reforms and any way to perfect this process. We've got a lot of work to do. We've done a lot of work, but we've got a lot of work to go before September 25 of this year. Thank you for listening.
Fred and John, I'd like to thank you for your plugs, shameless and otherwise. The idea behind this event is to plug everybody who is here, who is not plugged in already, to this political reform process, and in particular that means hearing from both of your organizations. So thank you very much for coming and sharing. I'm now going to turn it over to James Harrison, who will give us more of the legal background on these different reforms.
Good afternoon. My name is James Harrison. Fred and John got to talk about the policy issues. I'm the lawyer, so I get to talk about the real nuts and bolts. And being a lawyer, I have a PowerPoint, so hopefully you'll bear with me. There are three ways currently to propose changes to the Constitution. The legislature has three alternatives. One, it can propose amendments to the Constitution, a power it's had since California adopted its first Constitution in 1849. Two, it can propose a constitutional convention to revise the Constitution, also a power it's enjoyed since 1849. And third, since 1962, the legislature has had the power to propose revisions directly to the voters. In each case, the legislature acts by adopting a resolution by 2/3 of the members of each house, placing the proposed amendment, call for a convention, or revision before the voters. The voters currently enjoy just one of these powers. Since 1911, the voters have the power by collecting 8% of the signatures of voters who cast votes in the last gubernatorial election to propose amendments to the Constitution. The voters currently don't have the power to propose a revision or to call a constitutional convention, and of course, that's one of the things the Bay Area Council is contemplating changing. Could the voters amend the Constitution to permit the voters themselves to call the Constitution? That, of course, begs the question, what's the difference between a revision and an amendment? To paraphrase Justice Stewart's comment about the difference between art and obscenity, you know it when you see it. And that's pretty much the way the courts have addressed it over the years. A revision refers to a substantial alteration of the Constitution, and it can either be quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative revision is a change to a substantial number of the articles or provisions of the existing Constitution. A qualitative change, by contrast, can affect just a single article, but can be so sweeping that it affects the basic structure of our government. In either case, the voters currently don't have the power to propose revisions. Although numerous ballot measures have been challenged on the ground that they constitute a revision, most recently Proposition 8, the California Supreme Court has only struck down 2 ballot measures on the grounds that they constitute a revision. The first was in 1948 in a case called McFadden versus Jordan, where the court struck down a ballot measure that literally would have amended 15 of the 25 articles of the Constitution and added 21,000 words, affecting everything from oleomargarine to the Bill of Rights. If the single subject rule, which John referred to, had been in effect at the time, it probably would have been invalidated on those grounds, but it wasn't, so the court deemed it to be a quantitative revision and kept it off the ballot. The second case is a case called Raven versus Duke-Majan, in which the Supreme Court invalidated a measure that would have required certain criminal law rights to be interpreted consistently with the federal Constitution. The courts in California generally don't like it when voters try to interfere with their power, and they deemed the measure revision because effectively the voters transferred a significant portion of their own power to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's clear, I think, even with that simple outline, that a measure to give the voters the power to call a constitutional convention would not constitute a quantitative revision. After all, it would just affect one article of the Constitution, that's Article 18. However, arguments could be made that a measure giving the voters the power to call a constitution themselves and bypass the legislature would be a qualitative revision. First, the power to revise the Constitution has always been, since 1849, a power exclusively reserved to the legislature. The voters have the power to propose statutory and constitutional amendments, but the 1911 ballot measure that gave them that power did not give them the power to revise the Constitution or to call a constitutional convention. Second, although the California Supreme Court upheld Proposition 140, which, among other things, imposed term limits and limited the legislature's spending ability on the grounds that it was not a revision. The court nonetheless said that it was not a revision because it didn't, quote, diminish or delegate legislative power to anyone else. Arguably, if you give the voters the power to call a convention themselves, that would dilute the legislature's power. Third, while amending the Constitution is a relatively simple process, the Constitution has always imposed constraints on the ability to revise the Constitution. As the California Supreme Court said in the very first case in which it addressed the distinction between a revision and an amendment, the Constitution provided the formidable bulwark of a constitutional convention as a protection against the improvident or hasty or any other revision. On the other hand, there are very significant arguments that would suggest that an amendment to the Constitution to permit the voters to call a constitutional convention is just that, an amendment. First, as we all know, all political power is inherent in the people. Second, the people already have a substantial role in the Constitutional Convention process, including approving the legislature's call for a convention, electing the delegates, and then approving what the Constitutional Convention submits to the voters. Third, the courts have upheld other more far-reaching changes to the legislature's power, including Prop 140, which I referred to earlier, and Prop 13, just to name a couple. Fourth, if giving the power to the people to call a convention is a revision, you have to ask yourself how the power to propose initiatives themselves or the legislature's own power to revision could survive a similar challenge. And finally, if the legislature refuses to place a revision on the ballot or to call a constitutional convention, the voters would be left with literally no means to propose or consider revisions to the Constitution. All of those arguments suggest that such an amendment would be an amendment, not a revision. So if the voters were to call a convention, how would it work? Well, under the Constitution as it stands currently, the first step is that the legislature adopts a resolution placing the question before the voters. Second, the voters vote on the question of whether to call a convention. Third, within 6 months, the legislature has to provide for the convention, including the election of delegates. Fourth, the voters elect delegates from districts that are as nearly as practicable in equal population. Fifth, the delegates meet, debate, and propose a revised constitution. And finally, sixth, the voters voted up or down. One cautionary note, the last time this occurred, in 1933, the legislature voted to place a question before the voters to call a convention. The voters approved it in November of 1934, and what happened is that the legislature didn't act within the time specified for the measure to actually provide for the convention, so it died on the vine and no constitutional convention occurred. So this process has been somewhat troubled in the past. Thank you.
I'd like to thank James. I mean, we're very serious about this. You know, he's got all of the details, I've been going to these events over the course of the past several months, and I think that there's been a growing realization that people are in earnest about this process. No matter how it happens, something is going to happen, and so thanks for providing us with the details on that, James. And the final speaker for this panel, before we open it up to your questions, is going to be Thad. Is it Cowser? Cowser, that's what I thought. From Professor of Political Science at the University of California, San Diego. Thad.
Thanks very much. My slides up
there? Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much. I want to talk about the threshold question of whether California is ungovernable. We hear that word thrown out a lot lately, and on the same day that we had this failed special election where everyone was calling California ungovernable, we also had our governor back in Washington, D.C. accepting the president's praise for our solution for our approach to global warming as a national model towards the most pressing problem of the world. So the question is is California ungovernable, or are there some strengths to California's governing system that may be preserved in this process? I want to bring in some political science evidence on recent trends among our voters in our legislature, and most importantly, in the policies that California produces. Because while it's undebatable that California should be governed better, I think it's important to evaluate, use historical and comparative evidence to look at what areas is California performing well in. We've all sounded a lot like Chicken Little lately, and that's probably justified, but I want to evaluate exactly what parts of the sky are falling. So to do this, we've seen a particular charge recently in the press saying that California is gridlocked, not just with the budget, but with its ability to deal with the pressing problems of the time. And this is normally blamed on the partisan polarization in the legislature. And so, this is not just the press saying that, it's also former assembly members saying that this is what's going on. So I want to talk about a few important questions. Is the legislature polarized? What's the popular roots of that polarization, if any? And then finally, what does this lead to in terms of California's ability to address the big pressing policy challenges in any given year? On the first question, we actually have very good evidence on the level of polarization in the legislature, not just now, but historically. And this is research done by Seth Maskett, now at the University of Denver. And what this does is takes every vote ever cast on the floor of the California Assembly over time and uses the most modern sort of political science used to evaluate Congress and other areas to look at this question. And basically what this graph shows is this is pretty much the average distance between the average Democrat and the average Republican in the California legislature. So it's varied over time, but since the abolition of cross-filing, when people could run as members of both parties, it's just shot up and it's skyrocketed. So this should come as no surprise to anyone and really confirm part of this conventional wisdom about the increasing level of partisan polarization in California. Another place that we might look for this is to sort of blame it on the voters, right? This is all because voters are becoming more polarized. So the next bit of evidence was collected by Ted Lasher at CSU Sacramento and John Corey, and this looks at field poll data for over 20 years. The number of people who call themselves conservatives, liberals, and moderates in the California among the California electorate. You don't see a huge increase in polarization. If anything, there are actually more moderates among voters right now, right? So the question, why do the two caucuses in the legislature pull further and further apart as voters have, if anything, grown a little bit closer together? The answer is voters now have sorted themselves into the party that matches their ideology. This has happened at the national level, and this has happened very importantly over the last 30 years in California. Whereas if you're a liberal right now, you're almost overwhelmingly likely to become a Democrat. Same thing as if you're a conservative, you're going to call yourself a Republican and often vote that way. This was not the case 20 to 30 years ago in California. If you go back to, and that's now some research that comes from a book called The New Political Geography of California that I was involved in. If you look at how California has changed from being this north-south state 30 years ago to now being a state that's divided along east-west lines, where these dark districts are the ones held by Republicans, the light districts are the ones held by Democrats. These are congressional districts, but the map looks the same for the state legislature. In 1981, the Democrats had the Bay Area and lots of areas of Northern California, even some inland areas, and also only the most inner-city parts of urban Los Angeles, whereas Republicans were mixed throughout many coastal areas and many of the suburbs of Los Angeles and some respective area. And now, except for Orange County, Democrats dominate the coast and Republicans dominate in the eastern parts of the state. And what's really gone on here is that people in the Central Valley, which 30 years ago, the most Democratic by party registration region in California was the Central Valley. You had all these agricultural conservative Democrats who were part of that Democratic coalition, who were part of that Democratic legislative caucus pushing into the middle. And you also had suburban Republicans from areas like Pasadena, where I grew up, that always had Republican leadership for a long time. You also had more socially moderate and sometimes more fiscally moderate Republicans pushing that caucus towards the center. So really, California's electorate hasn't been polarized. In some ways, we just have better truth in advertising now. where the Democratic legislators are representing their constituency very, very well, and it's a much more liberal constituency than it was 30 years ago. So that's what has caused this apparent disjuncture between where voters are and where the legislature's at. And the next question becomes, what does this mean for our ability to solve the big problems pressing every year in California? And people in Congress have looked at this question by trying to read press accounts to figure out what are the big issues before the country, and I do this for California, in any given year, and then can the legislature and the governor work together to resolve them? So I'm going to show you a trend of gridlock in California government that uses what the LA Times covered in every January of the first year of every governor's term, starting in 1931. Of here are the big issues before California, and then we trace all the journalistic research, the journalistic coverage of these issues, find out what percentage of these issues actually get resolved. And at the end of the day, we come up with a gridlock percentage, which is the percentage of issues that just aren't resolved. So the conventional wisdom story is gridlock is skyrocketing in California, just like partisan polarization. But if we turn to this data, it's not. This is gridlock right here. This is partisan polarization. Gridlock doesn't really seem to rise and fall with the level of polarization when we're talking about issues that can be resolved through the normal majority vote legislative process. In California, in some ways, this shouldn't be too confusing, right? Because if all it takes is a majority of votes to pass a major issue, then all you need is one party in the legislature to move this issue out of the legislature. So if we're dealing with normal lawmaking, the legislature, by a majority vote, can often come to grips with the major issues of the day. What does explain patterns in gridlocks, it's not really partisan polarization. What does explain patterns in gridlocks, if you can move to the next slide, thanks, is divided versus unified government. All right, so this is the dark years are years when you either had a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor, or a Democratic legislature and a Republican governor. This is the gridlock percentage. It's about 20 percentage points higher when you have a member of one party leading the state and a member of the other party running the legislature. And this shouldn't be that surprising, and it also should serve as for us to question whether gridlock is that terrible a thing, or it's what voters want by sometimes balancing party control of the state. Now, the last bit of evidence I'm going to give you comes from new research done by a couple professors at Columbia, and it's looking across all states at the question of, are states delivering what voters want? So they take 39 different policy areas where you can get good public opinion data to figure out what the majority voter wants in every state, and then figure out, does the state deliver this policy? And they call this policy congruence. And what they found, looking across the states, was that the percentage of these 39 issues where the state's policy matches what voters want is actually the highest in California. We're the darkest on this measure. We do better than any other single state that does this. What predicts this across states? It's not the initiative process. It's states with more professional legislatures and a few other factors tend to deliver what voters want. But very importantly, when we're wrong in a leftward direction. When California government produces something that voters don't want, it's almost entirely likely to be too far to the left. So I think what all of these show together, and I just want to put out this data and then we can engage in the discussion about the lessons for reform, but I think what this last one shows is that California is not doing too terrible a job governing when we're not talking about the budget, when we're just talking about ordinary legislation. But we always have to keep in mind the balance of power that Fred started with, right? If we make the budget look like the rest of this by getting rid of the 2/3 rule, we have to worry, as many people do, about, will this move California too far to the left? There's always going to be a partisan policy directional consequence to all of our institutional reforms. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Thad, for telling us that there's actually nothing that we need to be worrying about. So, should we all just go home? No, let's not. In the next portion of the program, we'd like to hear comments and questions from the folks in the audience. So I believe that there will be a microphone going around that is currently in the back. So if you are interested in participating, please raise your hand, and then I will call on you, and Claudia will deliver the microphone to this gentleman over here. So please state your name and if you'd like your institutional affiliation.
Yeah, I'm Drew Mendelson. I work in the Treasurer's Office. Simple question is, if we call a constitutional convention, how broad is it? Is everything up for grabs? Can they limit it to a particular set of issues?
Absolutely. I think this is a very vital topic. Let's turn this over to the panel. Let's actually start with James. Is there anything legal that we...
Well, the Constitution itself doesn't prescribe any limitations. Of course, the call of the convention that the voters are asked to pass on could.
John?
Right. This is one of the most important questions that we have to answer. And so there's a school of state constitutional conventions at Rutgers Camden University. And constitutional conventions are weird to us in California, but they're not weird to a lot of people in a lot of other states. They're actually a fairly frequent occurrence. And most of the time, those conventions are limited. And every time you have, this is a lawyer's dream, doing a constitutional convention, I think, if you like to be in court, which we don't, but we're going to have to. But every time there's been a limited constitutional convention, it has been challenged in court, and every time it has been allowed to be limited. So the short answer is yes, we believe on what you can consider rock solid legal ground if such a thing ever existed, that you can limit a constitutional convention.
Fred, do you have anything to add to that?
Nope.
No?
All set.
All right. Derek?
This is Derek Cressman from Common Cause. I almost that exact same question. I mean, it seems to me there are a number of ways that could potentially limit a convention. One would be just politically, what would these delegates do? And depending on how they're selected, they're going to behave in a certain way. There's the fact that it needs to be approved by voters, and they may be considering that in their behaviors. And then there's the U.S. Constitution and the federal courts. But so on this legal question, setting aside those other things that might or might not limit what these delegates would do, what you're saying, John, is the folks at Rutgers have looked at this, and in every single instance where a state has attempted to legally restrict a convention, they've been successful in doing so, and there are no counterexamples to that?
That's what they've told us. Yeah, I'm not the lawyer myself, but I can only rely on good counsel.
And has Renshaw looked at this, James Harrison? Or?
We have not looked at the experience in other states. However, if you think about it as what's presented to the voters, the call itself, if the voters approve a measure that specifically restricts what the convention is to be about, then it would take a fairly bold court to overturn the voters' action. It might be a different case, however, if it were a pre-election challenge, because I think before it reaches the voters, courts generally have an easier time. But if the voters say, these are the 4 subjects we want to address, I think a court would be hard-pressed to say you can't.
I mean, I think this is one of the key issues that deserves a lot closer look. So right now there's a group of CSU, Sacramento, Stanford, and Berkeley who are trying to put together, so this is my pitch, trying to put together a conference to look really in depth at these issues, bring out folks like G. Allentar at Rutgers and people who have been involved in other state constitutional conventions so that we can solve any of these problems before we go ahead, or at least go in with our eyes open to them.
Claudia?
I'm Pete Martineau with Californians for Electoral Reform, THAD. Is it fair to say from your talk that if California provides what the voters want, that the center-left party is providing all the things that the people over on the center-right want also?
No, so there are 2 limits to that analysis, and I don't want to be seen as saying that the sky isn't falling. I think there are lots of problems with our current government, right? And one limit is none of those things look at the budget, right? None of those things look at, do Californians want a budget with constant structural deficits? No, right? So these are just 39 policy areas that are these dichotomous areas, right? You can either have the policy or not, and the second thing is, it doesn't show that the California government provides what everyone wants. It just says this is what the majority voter wants, and it's one definition of good democracy, and that's providing what the majority voter wants. We may not want that. We may want what a supermajority can agree on.
All right, terrific. The sky is in fact falling. All right, I'm glad that we got a chance to clear that up. And incidentally, I hope everybody feels welcome. You can just share your thoughts and comments on this. They don't have to be phrased as questions for the panel. So, do we have a?
My name is Chris Tapio, and I have a question about how electors to the convention would be chosen, or the people in the convention. You mentioned earlier maybe elected by district. Would they, what kind of a screening process have other states used, and what process would be in place to keep, the kind of the usual suspects from running, and perhaps, people associated with, the special interests that, are found, throughout the state. How do we keep vegetarians from, taking over the Constitutional Convention, or whoever it is, other sector of labor or the Chamber of Commerce, whatever interest group it is. How do you keep it so that you've got people that are, informed, interested, educated about the issue, and don't have, something to get from it?
Absolutely, John. So how do we recruit these mythical citizens who are very, very interested in California government but have no interests?
This is a great audience. You've hit on the top two questions right away. So the limited nature of a convention, and how are the delegates selected? So the delegates are selected according to what the initiative says, or what the enabling legislation says, depending if you're going through the legislature or you're going through a ballot measure. In the past, California has done elections of delegates. Other states have done all sorts of different things where the legislature calls themselves the Constitutional Convention delegates. Maybe we want that. I don't know. But the current one we're looking at is something that I don't know if it was originally from Canada, but it's called the Citizens Assembly model, where basically you randomly call a set of voters, driver's license people, the same sort of people you would call for a jury pool, and then you ask them, right now it's 25,000 Californians, you ask, are you willing to serve? Those that are somewhat interested come to an education process where they're told, are you going to get paid? Our answer to that right now is yes. How much time will it take? All those sorts of things. And then they say, okay, now that you know who wants to serve. By the way, let me ask a question. How many of you were proposing to pay the delegates the same amount as legislators make? Because these people would be legislating, which is 118, I think it's 118,000 a year, although they just are accepting pay cuts, right? So maybe it's a little less than that. But how many of you would be willing to spend 3-4 months serving as a Constitutional Convention delegate? Show of hands.
All right, we will be closing the doors and just getting this over with.
So that isn't that amazing? Well, it would break down. It would break down. I think it's $300 a day or something like that. But that's what you hear everywhere you go across the state. So people care obviously about their future, their state, and they want to do something about it. So this citizen selection process that we've got, the strength of it is at least twofold. One is that the people get there, they don't owe anything to anybody who asked them to get there. No one financed their campaign. And so they're, I hate to do this, but okay, it's like the Joe the Plumber thing, right? You got a grandmother, you got a truck driver, you got a surfer, lawyers, dentists, all those sort of people. California, all sorts of races, ages, everything. And so when they get together, they owe nothing to anybody except for trying to fix our state. And we think that'll be a huge motivator for them to make good decisions. It's also a real strength when we go back on the ballot in November of 2012, assuming we can do this thing, that people know that the decisions this group made, it was citizens like them. It wasn't special interest groups or lawyers or ivory tower or anything like that. It was people like them. So that's the current proposal.
Great, thanks, John. And I actually also want to put in a shameless plug for one of my own colleagues, Stephen Hill, who will be speaking on the second panel, actually in greater detail about delegate selection. So,
my name is Dick Taylor. I'm a volunteer at California Common Cause. I'd like to ask the panel members for their assessment of the members of the state legislature towards moving towards a constitutional convention.
Is the question, will they do that on their own for the California legislature?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, everything's under duress. I think one thing to keep in mind with all these possible avenues towards reform is to look down at the end of the road and say, what is most likely to be validated by the voters at the end of the day? right? So that we're not wasting time and wasting this moment. The British Columbia Citizens Assembly, as a wonderful experiment in democracy as it was, ended up putting something on the ballot that was eventually voted down. And there are a few questions here. Here's the trade-off with the legislature, right? One thing is, because things that go through the legislature need to get put on the ballot with a 2/3 majority, the deal gets done before it goes to the ballot. And if we look at constitutional amendments put on by the propositions put on by the legislature over California history, they pass at almost a 70% rate. If we look at ones put on through the citizen initiative process, they pass at closer to 30% rates. Right? And so the question is now, on the other hand, the legislature is not the most popular institution in California right now, and I can see a lot of these things going down merely because they came to the legislature. And so some idea of something that took both citizen involvement but had some sort of a filter of it getting a supermajority support from people of all political stripes in California before it makes it to the ballot, that might be, looking down the road, a system that's best set up for success.
Just real quick on the Citizens Assembly, sorry. It was actually passed by 58% of the voters with no campaign to support it, but they had to get over a 60% hurdle. And what I heard, although I have to double check this, is that they actually put it back on the ballot the next year and it did pass. But we have to double check that. But it did. It didn't. Okay, well, it did get 58% of the vote with no campaign, and we intend to campaign vigorously for this thing. So I'm sorry I did.
Fred?
Yeah, just a point here. Those of you who watch the legislative process, the legislature actually has two resolutions, one of them in the Assembly and the other one in the Senate, to call a convention. One of them has some details, the other one doesn't. Where's Darren? Darren?
Left.
He left. I was going to ask Darren to give you all an update on where those two measures are. If anybody knows, stand up and tell us what's happened to the Assembly resolution calling the convention and the Senate resolution. Anybody give us an update?
Tim? Tim Hudson with Sac State and a co-conspirator with Thad on another event this fall. Just on the question of whether or not you can limit a constitutional convention, I think Mr. Grubb and Mr. Harrison both spoke that the case law is very clear that it is constitutional to have a limited convention. The flip side, if you have a limited convention that then decides to unlimit itself, which is one of the questions we want to look into. The case law on that is a little more problematic. There are 4 state Supreme Court cases, almost all of which from the late 1890s or early part of the 20th century. 3 of the 4 said a convention that was called for a limited purpose and then decided to expand its agenda could in fact do that. And of course the mother of all examples was the Federal Constitutional Convention in 1787.
Great, thank you. Mark?
You have to, just real quick on that, imagine though if you have citizens together, do you think they're going to want to touch gay marriage or school and parent school or those sorts of things? So, but you're right, great question. Great question.
If you took a cross-section of Californians, you would have a cross-section of people for whom that would be a very important issue, and they would at least want to debate whether or not to take that.
Okay, fair
All right, Mark?
Yeah, I'm Mark Paul for New America. I want to ask about what seems a little bit of a contradiction between what James said and what John said with regard to the convention, and that is, James said that the Constitution requires the election of delegates. How would it be possible, or would it be possible legally, to actually have delegates to a convention who aren't elected, given that the Constitution specifies that? Would taking the power of the electors to pick, the Constitution, potentially run up against the question of revision?
Well, it's an interesting question. Clearly, you would have to amend the Constitution in the call of the convention, or separately to permit the delegates to be selected in some manner other than election. And on the one hand, you can argue that that suggests it could be a revision because you're taking away one of the voters' fundamental powers. On the other hand, the voters would be doing it to themselves. So it's a little bit different than taking the legislature's exclusive power to call a convention away from it. The voters would, in a sense, be limiting their own actions by providing a different methodology for selecting delegates.
Great, thank you. We actually have a lot of people who have joined us for this event online as well. It's being live webcast. And so we're going to take a question from the web.
We're working on it.
We are sorting. All right. Well then, we'll take another live question with no sorting whatsoever in the front here.
James with the State Senate. Is it possible to have real reform without addressing some of the sacred cows like Prop 13, Prop 98?
Good luck with that one, guys. Who's going to jump in? Fred?
Let me take a shot at it because a number of groups have looked at both of those issues. We had talked about the work of the Constitutional Revision Commission both in the 1960s and the work of a revision commission in the 1990s. And in the 1990 group, they looked at what an underlying obligation ought to be for the state with respect to K-12 education. It's been a priority since 1849. It was written into the Constitution as to have the first call in the general fund. So it's always been a priority. The real question is, how do you work it? How does the state maintain that priority? So I would suggest to you that with respect to school funding, again, it's been with us every decennium from 1849. There's been debate about it, whether to have an elected superintendent or not. So I'm not worried about that, frankly. I'm not so worried about Prop 13 either, because Proposition 13 had a couple of principles in it. One of them about limiting the ability of government in its own way at the community level to raise taxes without some concurrence on the part of the voters, if I can write it that large. The other was the way in which the property tax actually worked. And if you look back at some of the origins of Prop 13, it was really about how that tax operated in a real estate market. So if you step back from it and don't just read Section 1 that says there's a 1% tax rate, and you step back and say, how should the property tax operate? Then I'd argue that it's fair to think about how these systems work in a context of shared power. Remember this question of the balance of power? If you take it from that point of view, then I think it's rational to say, well, how do these things work in this era of, or in this question about how you balance power? So
am I hearing a yes from you? It would be on the table. That sounds like a yes to me.
Well, you can't. It's not an easy yes or no, because you have to step back and ask about this question of balance of power, and you have to ask that first. If you're unwilling to do that, then Prop 13 stays the way it is, and the Prop 98 guarantee stays the way it is.
Okay, fair enough. Have we processed or no? Okay. Well then, live people it is.
Those who show up, as they say, right? Pedro Morillas from CalPERC. Similar question to James's, except more along the lines of, if we're going to talk about real reform, then, I mean, to avoid gaming the system, we're going to come up with some way to elect the folks who participate in the Constitutional Convention. But then it seems like if we're going to pick and choose what they're able to debate beforehand, that opens up the system to gaming as well. So is there some way that we can avoid that? Is it just put all the cards on the table and everything's up for grabs and let the folks in the convention decide? Or is there some way to pick and choose how to limit the convention while at the same time avoiding the gaming of the system?
So we looked at the political and historical context for constitutional conventions, and there are two ways to kill a constitutional convention. Please nobody write this down. One is to delay the thing out until the political moment passes. Obviously, we're in a political moment right now. And then the second is to call out the Pandora's box. And they're going to, you make up the horror that people will say that they'll do. So we have been instructed that you should limit a constitutional convention if you want a chance of success for it. What subjects we're limiting it to? As I mentioned earlier, we've had hundreds of meetings, and we've got a lot more coming to try and figure out what is the consensus among Californians. There is a lot of consensus, actually, about the things that we need to fix. And so we've had these meetings, we're doing these town halls. Please participate. They're on our website, repaircalifornia.org, and you can host your own again and then tell us what you think. But that's sort of the process that we're trying to go through, is being as fair and transparent as possible.
All right, we're going to take a couple more questions, and we're going to have our second panel and be able to continue with this same discussion.
Linda Morshed with the Assembly. My question relates to the history of the first attempt that failed. The question that arose in my mind when you explained that was that maybe they ran out the clock on purpose. Your description right now of how to kill a convention suggests that perhaps is true.
Are you referring to the 1933, 34, 35 experience? Yeah, right. I mean, that's very instructive and part of the amendment revision conversation that you would have with the judge, I guess. But yeah, that's why we think we need to do the citizens model and give people in California the right to call a constitutional convention, is that we don't want to see that happen again.
All right, Kim over here.
Hi, I'm Kim Alexander with the California Voter Foundation. I just want to say first, thanks for putting this together and forging on this issue. I think there's, from the looks of it, a lot of interest in trying to get to some basic solutions. And I was really interested in Fred's comments. My own view is that one of the reasons why our government's so dysfunctional is because we never went through the period of being a territory. When we became a state, we jumped right into statehood, and we've never really stopped to take a breath and figured out if we organized it correctly or not. I currently have 22 people I elect to represent me at all levels of government in California, and I can't name them all for you or tell you what they do, and I'm president of the California Voter Foundation. So I feel like, this is a common problem for a lot of voters, and that we do have too much government in California, too much overlapping government at all levels dealing with the same public policy issues, which creates waste and accountability, inefficiency. I'm wondering, as you guys have been having these regional meetings, if this issue of needing to reform how we organize ourselves and our government at different levels has come up, whether we're looking at regional government, governing models being part of the topics that would be considered in this kind of a constitutional convention.
Yeah, just a quick response. In each one of our regional forums, there's a theme. And the theme is two-part. One of them is, do you trust state government enough to change its tax structure to put more responsibility at the state level with respect to funding K-12 education, health and human services? And it's on the issue of equity, say the state ought to be responsible for this level of activities. The needle goes pretty much negative. And the question is, how do you feel about resources for community needs, whether they're health and human services, we don't avoid them, K-12 education, and the needle goes back up into a positive range, and asking them to talk about people, business people, community leaders, to talk about that. They want to have some control over resources, and they think they have no control over the resources that they send to the state, even though some of that money is sent locally, but they don't feel that they have the control or the nexus being connected to it. And so, and that's been a consistent message that we've had in every one of the forums, wherever we are in the state, Southern California, Northern California.
I'm going to take one quick webcast question and then one last live question, and then we'll move on to the next panel. Thank you, Claudia.
Okay, so one question from our Twitter feed, twitter.com/NewAmericaCA.
Wow.
The panelists spoken to past failures of conventions in other states. Are there examples of success, and what has made them so?
This is what Twitter wants to know, guys, so get it right.
In 140 characters or less.
Yeah. Actually, do each of you have a short response to that?
Look at Illinois, Michigan, and I think Hawaii is it. But when you ask Alan Tarr, who's the head of that, is it Rutgers, Camden, or Camden Rutgers, School of Constitutional, State Constitutional Conventions, they love Illinois as a great example, and as a matter of fact, we've done a lot of research on that. People of Illinois really like their Constitution. They may not like their governor, but the Constitution can only protect you from so much stuff. So yes, there are great examples out there.
All right, Mike?
Yeah, Michael Feinstein, former mayor in Santa Monica and co-founder of the Green Party here in California. I just want to argue strongly that regardless of how far the legislature goes, and I'm thrilled that the California Forward people are trying to push them, that we shouldn't stop there in any case. One, because the breadth of the reforms will not be broad enough, number one, but even bigger, something of enduring benefit for our entire state is As voters, we're either trapped in single-member districts with a majority party, and either you vote for the majority party and you win, or you have no voice, or we get to vote yes or no on ballot measures crafted by a small number of people who raise the money and then pay to get them on. I'm happy that we have those institutions, but here, if we have a process where regular people in the state are actually able to affect their future directly, regular people, it's going to change the way people look at how their government works in the state. That's something that all of us who are part of this movement can give a gift to this generation and going forward.
Thank you, Mike. There was a question earlier that I believe we'll have the perfect person to answer it has just walked in. If he doesn't mind my putting him on the spot. Senator DeSaulnier has been an advocate of constitutional reform within the legislature, and so I think he'd be an excellent person to speak to how this effort has been received. Senator?
Boy, that's really putting me on the spot. Well, lately, thanks to a lot of the work that the Bay Area Council's done in California Forward, I think. Do you want me to walk so people don't have to turn their back? Is this okay?
Sure.
How are you? See how I can handle this with no rehearsement. I think it's a mixed probably reception. I didn't expect people to open their arms to a constitutional convention. There's a lot of concern within the building, and you've probably talked about this, about a runaway convention. Personally, I think some of that is just the psychology of letting go. So we've tried. The Bay Area Council's done a wonderful job of saying you can define what a convention will do. We have a bill, and there's the Bay Area Council has a bill that as of right now, I'm going to carry. So we'll like to introduce that to Senate elections within the next couple of weeks. But I have to get a sense, to be honest, with my two Democratic colleagues, Senator Hancock, who's the chair, and Senator Liu and I are the three Democrats on Senate elections. So I'd like to get a sense that we can move it through and at least keep the discussion going. That doesn't sound very optimistic, does it? Because there is a lot of resistance. I've had some conversations with Assemblymember Blakesley, who's a good friend, who's the new leader of the Republican caucus in the Assembly, obviously, and he introduced a bill at the beginning of the session. So the two of us, without talking to one another, had both had an interest and introduced a bill. I think Sam is not most likely going to move his bill because of reluctance from within his caucus. I would like to move our bill. And then potentially what that has to set up is the Bay Area Council's idea that they would go outside the building and get votes to try to form one. In terms of reform, I'm not completely wedded to the convention. I just think that you have to have the discussion to get any kind of serious reform as California Forward suggesting. So I don't care how we get there. I just think it's obvious that we need the results that you folks are talking about. I'm inclined to think, after being a county supervisor for 4 terms before I came up here, is that it's not going to happen inside the building. And if it does happen inside the building, it will be because of this enormous pressure that will go outside the building. So how's that for a short introduction?
That's terrific. Thank you very much, Senator. And that actually transitions very well into questions about where we'll actually be going with this process. So I'd like to call my colleagues Mark, Steve, and Tomas up, and I'd like to everybody give a round of applause for the first panel. Thank you very much.
Hello.
It's right over here, buddy.
All right. So, what would you do if you had a friend who was a long-distance runner but didn't finish his races quickly enough? What would you do? you'd probably want to make sure that he had plenty of time to train, had access to the right facilities, was eating all the right foods, and you'd probably look at his technique, right? That's what you would do. Now, if this friend of yours was the government of the state of California, what would you do? You'd break his leg, right? And then when he didn't finish his next race on time, what would you do? You break his other leg. And then you'd spend a bunch of time talking about what a lousy runner your broken-legged friend was, right? That's what we do here in California. And until we stop doing that, we're going to keep getting the same results that we have. Every element of our governmental system undercuts every other element. That's the system we've got set up. Majoritarian democracy has been eliminated by the 2/3 vote. The legislature's ability to budget is undermined by ballot box budgeting. Sensible tax policy is impossible in the face of Proposition 13. California government doesn't work because it cannot work. There is not a coherent plan for how California government should work, even in theory. No one in this room can explain to me how the current system of California government is supposed to work in practice, because it doesn't. And you all know it, right? So on the first panel, we looked at some different paths to what you might call California version 2.0. Each of these paths has its advantages and its disadvantages, but it's important to focus on not only how we're going to get there, but where we are in fact going. The end result of any process, whether it's a jury selection process or an elected process or an inside game or an outside game, if the legislators do it or we have to do it ourselves with these people in this room, the new result needs to be a coherent, workable system of government, otherwise we'll end up back in the same fix we're in now. The problem is that the political process inherently requires compromise. But if you make too many compromises, to use a software development metaphor, you create bugs in the system, right? That means that we will need a massive upgrade eventually. In the case of the United States, for example, the maintenance of slavery was a terrible bug in the system, and it was inconsistent with our provision of fundamental rights to everyone, and it required a bloody civil war and 150 years to work that bug out of the system. So we should at least start with a coherent plan for how the people's will gets effectively translated into actual policy outcomes. We're all familiar in this room with the American constitutional system. So one option would be California version 1.0, right? We could return to how the American system is supposed to work, which would mean, by the way, getting rid of the 2/3 vote in Proposition 13 and term limits in the initiative process, and all those things that aren't in the coherent system that we set up here in the United States. Now, it may or may not be politically feasible to actually do this. We may be too attached to the bugs that we have put into that particular system. Oh, you can't go after this bug. Can't go after this bug, right? Proposition 13 is inviolable. Well, so maybe what we need to do is move to a wholly new system of government, right? One that's in line, ideally, with the preferences and political realities of the California of today. My colleague Mark Paul and I advanced just such a proposal, and we call it personalized full representation. It's a mouthful. Personalized full representation for the 21st century, or PFR 21. Now, yeah, right? Well, but here's the thing about it. It's the system that's actually in place in the vast majority of countries in the world. 18 out of the 21 members of the Organization of Economic Cooperation, well, whatever, the first, the developed world, use a system called mixed member proportional representation. And that's what we're proposing that we should do in California. So it's kind of radical from the standpoint of California, but it's not so radical to say, well, we've thought about government over the course of the past 250 years a little bit, and we've come up with this system, and so let's use something like it. It has a few compelling features. First, it preserves single-member districts, so you still have a community connection to your legislator. In fact, in Mark and my proposal, the districts are even smaller, so the community connection is even stronger. Second, it's a system of proportional representation, so there are many different parties to choose from. Last year, PPIC did a survey in which over half of Californians said they wanted a third major party. Now, this is not going to happen in our current system for political science reasons that I don't have time to get into right now. But it's a basic feature of a system of proportional representation. And the final element of Mark's and my proposal is that it would have regional representation. So you get two things that we don't have in California currently. Regional representation for a state that's largely organized around regions now. You get choice of many different parties, and you get better connection to your legislators. All the details in this proposal, a long paper that we wrote, are available on our website, and the executive summary is available at the side of the room. This is a big idea, right? But this is the time to be talking about big ideas. And we believe fundamentally that we had Sunny Wright McPeak, who is the one of the board members for California Forward, here at an event back in November, and she said, let's not undersolve this problem, right? Since we have a crisis is a terrible opportunity to waste, let's put forth ideas that are commensurate to the scale of the challenges that we face. So all the members of this panel are going to be talking about big ideas for California version 2.0. We'll start with Mark Paul. He is the Deputy Director and Senior Scholar of the California program at the New America Foundation. And he'll be talking about the budget process and focusing not only what we should put in the Constitution, but also what we shouldn't. We'll then proceed to Tomas Jimenez, who's a professor of sociology and an Irvine Fellow at Stanford University and an Irvine Fellow at the New America Foundation. He'll be talking about diversity and democracy with a particular focus on generational status. And we'll wrap up the panel presentations today with Stephen Hill, who is the Director of the Political Reform Program at the New America Foundation. He'll be presenting his big ideas about the fine details of the Constitutional Convention, specifically these issues that we've been focusing on here so far today, including the scope of the convention, its mandate, and delegate selection, and then we'll reopen the floor to your questions and comments. Mark.
Thanks, Micah. I doubt so many of you would be here today were it not for the results of the May 19th special election and the sense that they created that California is truly ungovernable, to use the word that Thad used earlier. So I want to start today with trying to answer a question. Did the election tell us anything about the direction that California voters want to go? Now, I don't subscribe to the two most common schools of political interpretation in this town. The first school takes it as a given that whatever the voters said, they agreed with me. There's a technical term for this interpretation. It's called the every woman's first husband school of political interpretation. The second school, which afflicts politicians and pundits alike, is to listen to whatever the voters have said and try to find a pedestal to put it on. And this school of interpretation has a technical term too. It's called the My Brilliant Child School of Political Interpretation. But I would argue that the plain fact of the matter is that the tiny slice of the electorate that went to the polls last month threw a hissy fit. They said, we don't want tax increases, we don't want spending cuts, we don't want any more borrowing. Find some other way to solve the budget crisis and don't bother us anymore. There's no brilliance there. But maybe, if you squint really hard and are in a charitable frame of mind, you're offenders in this regard. But California is certainly among the very, very worst. We here have loaded the Constitution with budget rules, with tax and spending limitations, with spending mandates and protected programs. Again and again, California and its voters have accepted the argument that a particular policy outcome is so very important to California that it can't be left to the ordinary tug and pull of priority setting in politics. We've been told over and over again that unless we pass Proposition 98 or Proposition 13, the schools would crumble and taxes would soar. But I'm going to argue here that if you look at the evidence from around the country, and here I'm relying on a lot of research that the political scientists and economists have done, that the evidence doesn't support those claims by and large. The states that require supermajorities to pass tax increases may have somewhat lower levels of taxation, although you wouldn't know it from listening to talk radio here in California and some of our politicians. But even more, supermajority rules seem to shift taxation away from general taxpayers and onto subgroups of the population. Also, spending limitations and supermajority requirements for passing budgets, if anything, overall seem to result in higher levels of spending in the states where they've been adopted. Furthermore, 2 decades of Proposition 98, our school funding guarantee, have left California with schools funded at lower levels than in states that have no such guarantees, and at lower levels today as a percentage of our wealth than when Ronald Reagan was governor. Instead, what California's constitutional fiscal restraints have produced is more borrowing and less flexibility to deal with the crises like today's, as we saw so vividly last month. What the evidence from California and around the country seems to tell us that it is not constitutional budget rules ultimately, but the political desires of the electorate that shape our fiscal policy. And the brilliant children get what they want. But unfortunately, the system as it now exists in California is built to accommodate their worst instincts, which is to ask for something for nothing. So I would argue that constitutional fiscal reform that California needs are more about subtraction than about addition. When it comes to fiscal provisions for a new constitution, less is going to be more. Now, we need look no further than the U.S. Constitution. If you blink while reading the U.S. Constitution, you will miss the few scant provisions dealing with public finance. There are no fancy mandates, no straitjackets, just a few simple rules establishing the roles of the executive and legislative branches of government in raising and spending money. And yet, for the last 200 years, within that sketchy framework, presidents and Congresses have managed to make and change fiscal policy in accordance with the voters' wishes. What we need in California, I would argue, is a new constitutional framework that provides what the federal Constitution does. A clean and uncomplicated set of rules for public finance that doesn't enshrine the policy wishes of the left or the right in our fundamental document. And an improved legislature and electoral system that ensures that a majority of Californians can replace the party in charge if it strays from the course they want. Now, there are a lot of good ideas that, some of them that Fred mentioned earlier this morning about for how California can improve its budgeting and restore fiscal discipline. Pay-as-you-go budgeting, 2-year budgets, performance or outcome-based budgeting, longer-term horizons for budget decisions. All of these are really great ideas, and I think we ought to consider them in California. But none of them belongs in the Constitution. What California needs to do is to strip the fiscal policy out of the fundamental document and relegate all of it to statute. All that needs to be put in the Constitution are some simple rules requiring fiscal transparency, honest accounting, limits on long-term debt, a separation of operating and capital budgets, which is part of the transparency and debt rules, and strict and rigorous balanced budget requirements, because ultimately states, unlike the federal government, do need to balance their budgets. It's just a reality that we face. And these need to be put in place not only for the legislature and governor, but also for the initiative process. We have one of the reasons we are in the deep hole we are in California is because we've created, through the initiative process, a place where people can escape the normal discipline of budget process. And any place, politics is like plumbing. Water will flow to the weakest defense. And we've ended up in California doing a lot of things on the budget that don't make any fiscal sense. Our constitutional restraints, and the few of them we have, should be aimed exclusively at the natural and curbing the natural and human political weakness to want to have something for nothing and to send the bills for our today, for what we want today, to our children's generations. But even as we make it possible for the legislature, the elected majority in the legislature and for the governor to write budgets and set policy, we must also make it possible for the voters to change the majority if they don't like the result. The big earthquakes in California's fiscal life over the last 3 decades have been triggered when Sacramento ignored or lagged the wishes of the electorate. And Thad talked a bit about this. A lack of political accountability and leadership led to shackles and straitjackets, which have led in turn to gridlock and crisis. So I'm going to say that this is the takeaway message. The political reform and fiscal reform are two halves of the same walnut. We can't have one without the other.
Well, thanks so much. I'm going to be talking about making democracy and diversity work, mostly from my perspective as someone who studies immigration and immigrant integration. So while my colleagues on the first panel and this panel have talked mostly about the political system and its nuts and bolts, as one person has said, I'm hoping to talk about the personnel who will ultimately be plugged into that system. Namely California's diverse population. And so we normally think of diversity like this. We normally think of it in terms of race and ethnicity, and it's no surprise to anyone who lives in California that California is in fact an incredibly diverse state when we think about it in racial and ethnic terms. We have a population that is roughly 37% Latino, roughly 12% of Asian origin. We have a population that where the white population is in fact a numerical minority. But I want us to think about diversity in another sense, and that's by immigrant generation, where the first generation is regarded as the immigrant generation itself, the second generation are the children of immigrants, third generation will be the grandchildren, and so forth and so on. And when we think about diversity in terms of immigrant generation, California still looks incredibly diverse. Stay there. No, go back. If we look here just at the, my PowerPoint, my laser pointer is not showing up, but if you look at the first set of columns on the left-hand side here, it shows that roughly half of California's entire population is either immigrant or second-generation children of immigrants. And I want to draw your attention here to the children. These are individuals who are 18 years and under. 41% of the children in California are the children of immigrants, and notice that category of the immigrant generation, the first generation, shrinks dramatically. And so the first message here is that California is diverse in terms of race and ethnicity. It's also diverse in terms of immigrant generation. And as we look to the future of California's adult population, you're going to be looking at a population that is increasingly comes from the second generation children of immigrants. And this slide gets the message across, hopefully, in even better graphical terms, showing here this sort of greenish-gray portion. These are the second-generation children of immigrants, and you can see they represent a fairly substantial proportion of California's young population. This brings to light what I think is, and Claudia's offering a laser pointer. I have one, but for some reason it's not showing up here, and I won't test it on your eyeballs because that can be dangerous. But this brings to light what I think is a significant challenge to democracy when we think about diversity in California, and that's the legal status of our immigrant population. California leads the nation in many different categories, one of which is in the number of unauthorized immigrants. Now, California's unauthorized population as a proportion of the nation's whole has shrunk pretty dramatically. If you were to go back to 1990, 42% of the nation's unauthorized population lived in California. Today it's about a quarter. But nonetheless, that is still a population that is far too large. We have about 2.7 unauthorized immigrants living in California. These are individuals who, because of their legal status, can in no way, shape, or form participate in the formal political process, and whose legal status, makes them unlikely to participate in civic society in ways that are so important for democracy. But it's not just about the immigrants themselves, it's again about the children of immigrant population. This shows here that nationwide that half of all unauthorized immigrant households are families with children. And it's quite likely, although I don't have the specific figures, that the picture doesn't look all that different in California. And we know from research that's coming out right now from UCLA and UC Irvine that the legal status of parents has a dramatic effect, a negative effect, on the U.S.-born children who are growing up in these households. It has a negative effect on their health outcomes. It has a negative effect on their educational attainment. It has a negative effect on their earnings well into adulthood. And so the handicaps that are associated with legal status are not just those suffered by the immigrant population itself, but also by their children. You can skip this one for the sake of time. And I think this speaks to a second challenge when we think of California's diverse population and trying to make democracy work, and that's related to education. Now, we know in the state of California, and in fact nationwide, that there are large disparities in terms of educational attainment between racial and ethnic groups. But what I'd like to point out today is that there are disparities within racial and ethnic groups, and those disparities break down by generation once again. And so I'll call your attention here to this left-hand column, which shows the percentage of individuals who do not finish high school. And all of these individuals who were surveyed here are 25 years and older. And if you look, going down here first, looking at the Asian Pacific Islander population, overall the total population, 14% have not finished high school. Among the immigrant population, it's 16%, 4% in the second, 7% in the third. So we see, with the exception going between second and third, but a dramatic decline in the population that is not finishing a high school degree. The same can be said for Latinos. And so in some ways within ethnic groups, we can think that this is a positive trend. It looks like immigrant integration, although in particular for Latinos, by the time you get to the third generation, that is the U.S.-born children of U.S.-born parents, you still have 22% of individuals who are not finishing high school. Far too many. And I put this up here. This is it comes from an article that was published in the Sacramento Bee about a year ago to show that even when we look at racial disparities by race and ethnicity, African Americans here having a four-year high school dropout rate of 41% show up as a significant part of the larger picture that I'm talking about. And so I think we can get a fuller handle on why this matters. If you look into California's future now, if we look at the year 2030 and we look at where the growth of our working age population comes from, if you look at where the growth in the voting age population comes from, it comes overwhelmingly, in fact, almost entirely from the immigrants and their children. If you look here just at where the growth comes from, if you look here just at Latinos, this indicates that 43% of the growth of the working age population by 2030 will come from the Latino second generation alone. 43%, nearly half of the growth in California's working age population will come from the immigrant children of Latinos. And so how do we make this work? And I'm painting with some very broad strokes here, hoping to motivate some discussion. The first thing I think we need to recognize is that although we often think of immigration as a federal issue, although I'd argue that states and localities are thinking less and less about immigration as a federal issue, we need to think about legal status and naturalization as important California issues. They're important California issues not only because the immigrant generation suffers from the lack of legal status, but also because the children of immigrants suffer. The second thing I think we need to think about, and this is something that I've called for, and to the extent that everyone else is plugging something, maybe I'm plugging something here too, but I think that we should be thinking about having a comprehensive immigrant integration policy. At the federal level, we have an immigration policy, but we don't talk much about an immigrant policy. And I think that California would do well to follow the lead of states like Illinois, Massachusetts, Washington, New Jersey, states that have looked at implementing some form of a comprehensive immigrant integration policy with English language acquisition, with citizenship classes as centerpieces. And finally, I think we need to think seriously about preparing the next generation of California's leaders. Leaders in business, leaders in politics, leaders in education. And as I pointed out already, that population will come overwhelmingly from today's immigrants and from their children. And so we should be taking a long, hard look at what we're doing in our cuts to our K through 12 education system, community college, the Cal State, the UC. Schools have always been the engine of immigrant integration, and at no other time in California's history have we needed that engine to be powered, and I fear that we're powering it down right now. So I'll leave us with that.
Thank you so much, Tomas. We wanted to invite Tomas to come here and speak because we talk about that we, the Californians, are going to do this, or that the people are going to do that in the abstract. But the California people isn't abstract. It looks a certain way. It has a certain characteristics. They come from certain places. And so I think any reasonable conversation about massive political reform in California should really incorporate a real understanding of who is California, because you don't always get a representative sample of California in these rooms or in our government. And finally, I'd like to call on Stephen Hill to come up and cap off the day for us. Yeah, absolutely.
How's that position? Can you hear it? No?
Tilt it towards you.
All right, let's see. Bear with us. I guess it's as far as it goes.
Yep.
All right, how's that? Any better?
Yeah.
I'll crouch. Whenever, of course, when we're talking about doing something like a constitutional convention, the devil really is in the details. And as more and more people are starting to think about this as a viable possibility for California, more people are starting to wonder about the details, like delegate selection, the scope and mandate of the convention, and some of the questions that have already been talked about. So what I'm going to do in my few minutes is just drill down a little deeper into some of these details as ideas for all of you to think about. I'll be interested in your reactions and your own thoughts to what's being discussed and talked about. In terms of delegate selection, actually there's not been in today's LA Times about delegate selection on the table over there, so I encourage you to pick it up. It'll summarize a lot of what I'm going to go through here. But there are three basic ways. You can appoint them, elect them, or randomly select them. And you could do interesting hybrids of each, a couple of these, or all three of them. There's no, we're making it up here, just as the founders and framers did in 1787. They had no models to go on, and they were making it up. We're doing the same thing at this current time. So there are pros and cons to each of these methods. There's no perfect method. And the more you look at it, the more you realize that maybe what we're looking for here is the least worst method. Isn't that often life? I mean, it was Winston Churchill that said democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried. So let's run through these a little bit. Appointed. The virtue of appointed, for those who are putting this forward, would be that, in theory at least, you'd appoint the best and brightest that California has to offer. But it raises the obvious question: who would do the appointing? Would it be the governor? Would it be the legislature? Some combination? Some have proposed that, let's get a group of reformers and lock them in a room and tell them they don't come out till they redesign California 2.0. But who would select the reformers? And so this really is the crux of that issue: is that if we appoint them, might that undermine the credibility of the of the delegates themselves to this convention, because they would be seen as perhaps captured by the same forces that currently are seen as influencing government, special interests, and what have you. It's perhaps instructive, as John Grubb said earlier, that of the 14 or so states that have an automatic calling for a convention, none of them appoint the delegates. And that's something that we really have to think about. And also, if we appoint them, would it be a convention that really mirrors what California looks like and thinks like? So secondly, so that's kind of the pros and cons of the appointed method. The elected method, pros and cons. The pros would be, we're familiar with it. The delegates would have the gloss of having been elected through a democratic procedure, and therefore perhaps would be seen as legitimate in that way. But the cons would be if we use the same methods we use to elect the legislature today, which is a legislature that is, many people see as a failure, then perhaps we would get a group of delegates that is seen in the same light as the legislature today. For example, the state assembly districts have over 450,000 people. So that means if you have delegates running in districts that size, as some have proposed, they would need a significant amount of money to run in those districts. And that raises the usual familiar issues of where would they get that money, which special interests, would they have to go to political parties and get their endorsements? Would we basically end up with the same type of dynamic in our elections for this constitutional convention that we have with our elections today? And if so, if that's how it's perceived, it would discredit this body before it even took off. And so, you go through the pros and cons of these methods, and that's where in some ways the randomly selected body starts looking like the least worst method. Because with a randomly selected body, working off the model that the Bay Area Council has proposed, with 400 delegates being randomly selected, 5 per assembly district, there's no question that from a representative sample standpoint, random selection will give you a more representative group of delegates than any of these other methods, just because you can do it in a certain way using different procedures that have been devised for these sorts of things to make sure that it is representative. And secondly, by using a random selection, it sort of gives it the sense of what people like us are in the room, in the sense that average Californians will be redesigning California 2.0. Now, depending on your point of view, that's a good or a bad thing. I mean, one person said it, how would we make sure that a room full of dummies created something smart, as one person who obviously doesn't like the random selection method put it. And we can smirk about that, but there is a legitimate question there of how would average Californians get up to speed on all the issues, even with a limited mandate to the Constitutional Convention. How would they get up to speed on these issues? And what has been used in other places is, for example, you would have about an 8-month-long process here. As John Grubb mentioned, they would be paid. The first 6 weeks or so is an intensive educational process in which experts are brought in from all political sides to give their views on what the problems of California are, what the potential solutions are, and what sort of things the delegates should pay most attention to. And in this process of bringing all points of view inside to this process, it allows for the type of discussion and debate that becomes an intensive educational process for these delegates. Now, the other thing I would mention is that besides the random selection process, we have the potential to create a constitutional convention like has never been done before, because we have all sorts of technologies available to us today, like the internet, like live webcasting. The fact that right now you are all sitting here in this room listening to this event, and there are other people around California that are watching it on the web. That's the type of technology I'm talking about, using keypad polling devices. Maybe some of you have been in meetings where you would ask to give your policy preferences, pushing the little buttons on the keypad punch cards, and these sorts of things. So it allows us to bring people into this process all around California, even those who aren't randomly selected to be part of this process, in a way that has never been done before. And in a way that would not only bring all sorts of points of view into it, but would give it a sense of legitimacy that it's going to need if it's going to be putting things on the ballot. To give you an example of how these sorts of randomly selected bodies and this type of technology can work, in Louisiana, after the Katrina tragedy there, they had to figure out how to spend redevelopment dollars, and they're having a hard time finding consensus of all the various stakeholders. So they convened in a large convention hall in New Orleans a randomly selected delegate body of over 4,000 people. 2,000 of them were in New Orleans. The other approximately 2,000 were in 20 different cities around the United States, the diaspora that had been scattered as a result of that tragedy, who were able to simultaneously be involved in this same meeting with the people there in New Orleans. And they were able to use these different technologies to have people weigh in on things like rebuilding homes, flood protection, crime protection, social services, and all sorts of things that then became part of the unified New Orleans redevelopment plan, and changed that plan in a way that everyone who was involved in the process acknowledges was in a very positive way. So we can use these technologies in a way to draw people in and really tap into that genius of all of Californians who have points of view on how these sorts of things are affecting them and how any changes will affect them. Now, in looking at, besides New Orleans, they've done other these sorts of randomly selected bodies and using these technologies in other places, in San Mateo for working on housing, for example, in Texas for working on renewable energy and wind power. Really, there's dozens and dozens of examples in the United States where they've used these technologies. And what you see when you talk to the people who participated and the practitioners who are out there who facilitate these processes is that people who come to these are diverse. They are Democrats, they are Republicans, they are Greens, Libertarians, they're from all sorts of points of view, they're from all sorts of races. But when they get into the room, they tend to check their partisanship at the door, because they suddenly realize that they are being called upon by their fellow citizens to structure these solutions that everyone needs. And they feel that sense of importance and the gravity of their situation. And what emerges in transcript after transcript, when you look at what happens in these events, is this sort of common sense pragmatism about how to find solutions to the problems. And I think that in some ways is really the genius of these sort of randomly selected bodies using these different technologies, that we're going to be putting people in a room who don't have the usual partisan axis to grind, who aren't looking necessarily about how it's going to affect their own re-elections. They're not looking at how it's going to affect their colleagues who are looking to get re-elected or any sorts of things. They're simply thinking about what is good for my state, what is good for my children and our communities, and what kind of common sense pragmatism can we bring to it. Suddenly you're sitting across the table in these processes, or across the video link in the example where people are in different geographic locations, with your own shadow, in a sense, the person who has the opposite point of view of you. In some cases, your own worst nightmare. The person who you would never normally dialogue, who often don't dialogue in the building across the street over there. And suddenly you have to dialogue with them because you've been charged by your fellow citizens with coming up with solutions. And that's what drives the momentum of this, in some ways, the excitement of doing it in this way. So I think by convening these sorts of random selected bodies, we have the opportunity in California to do something that's really never been done before, and drawing in Californians in a way that hasn't been done before. And then once they come up with their proposals, and because of the way you've included so many Californians in the process, that becomes the momentum that then goes out and helps to foment the dialogue that's going to happen over the proposals. So you have the kind of neighbor-to-neighbor discussion that's going on in these sorts of things. And you have the over-the-fence discussions about, what do you think about that proposal for how we would elect our legislature differently, or how we would do our budgets differently in California. And so I really do expect that if we engage in a process like this, we will be able to see that kind of groundswell of interest and discussion that people like Alexis de Tocqueville talked about in the early years of our country, when in the 1830s, when he was here and saw how people just engaged so much in the nitpicky things about government, and for the most part, Americans have stopped doing that, and Californians too. We more just, it gets so disgusting to watch. We feel like we're cut out of the process, and so there's really no self-interest really in engaging at that level. Well, what we're suggesting is that it is possible to re-engage even a state like California, 36 million people, in a way that has never been done before. And so this is the possibility I think we're looking at.
much, Stephen. We're going to stick around and answer questions for anybody who's interested, but for those of you who need to leave at the point that the program was originally supposed to end, I want to thank all of you for being here. This has been a really fantastic conversation. Please stay connected to us here at the New America Foundation and to the other organizations who have presented here today. And I just want to really say that we appreciate your participation today, so thank you.
So I think we would see, and then also I didn't go into it, but
yes.
My name is Deanna Marquardt, and I don't have an institutional affiliation, but I have been a public policy analyst and consultant for many years as an independent. And I have a comment, not a question. I came here today hoping I would hear something I hadn't heard before, whether it was a concern or a new idea. I really didn't care. I just wanted to hear somebody say something I haven't heard before. And I am so excited about EFR 21. I think that the Constitutional Convention obviously has a lot of energy behind it and commitment and good intentions and a lot of good stuff. But it's, as a policy analyst, I would call it a distinction without a difference. I think that people who, however they got selected for that opportunity would behave and feel pretty much the way new legislators do. You know, they come, they're excited, they're committed, they're eager to get something done, but the entrenched interests know how to work that body. And they would know how to work a constitutional convention body. But one of the great advantages that I see in the new system that you have proposed here is that there are multiple centers of activity and decision making and places where issues, the same issues will be dealt with differently. And I think that's superior.
Great.
At the end of a constitutional convention, we would still have really nothing that we don't have now, which is still the same set of problems, maybe a new set of institutional arrangements proposed, but nobody working on things in a different way.
Well, I appreciate your plug. I'm quite fond of our proposal, and you know, we've been talking to some folks about it. Other questions?
Right, two points. I'm an educator at California Department of Education, but 2 points. I was in New Orleans, and I was very impressed with the overall sense of this is our community. There was no us, them. I was there within the last year in the rebuilding, and I kind of remarked about the contrast with something went wrong in California, that in the face of a crisis, we've had difficulty passing legislation, passing things because, well, what's in it for me versus this tremendous sense of an us that you find in New Orleans. The second point is, somehow in complex issues, a number of us are experts in our specific fields. Would you involve experts? And the challenge with those dummies is really for the experts to be able to speak clearly enough for anyone to understand it, not just up on our own pedestals, which limits the effectiveness of what we say in our output.
I think that's an excellent comment. Mike?
Yeah, can you explain how the regional election portion of your plan would work and why that is good for public policy in California?
Mark?
Yes. The way we've proposed is to have the elections for the state legislature organized around, in our proposal, 8, basically the urban regions of California, the natural regions, and so that in Southern California and in the Bay Area and in the Sacramento region and the San Joaquin Valley, there would be campaigns focused on the issues the legislators would be selected by votes that happen within those regions. And we give California an opportunity for each of its regions to have its own conversation about what it needs and what it wants from one government. Now, one of the great difficulties, that we have in California is that we built a government system in the middle of the 19th century when there were only a handful of us here, and now there are 38 million. And the world has changed dramatically, and there is no really, for instance, there's no California economy. We have regional economies, separate regional economies in this state, which operate under the rubric of California law. But in fact, they're all quite distinct. The Bay Area is as different from the San Joaquin Valley, as New York is from Wyoming. And so, when we were crafting a proposal, we were trying to do it with the thought that it's impractical, we think, to break up California into smaller pieces. So the thought is, how could we have a government that more naturally reflects the way we've organized ourselves as a society and an economy? So.
I also wanted to give Stephen the opportunity to respond to the last questioner.
Yeah, just to fill in a little bit about how currently how we're conceiving of the education process with this body. And this could work for any of the type of body, whether it's selected by appointment, election, or randomly selected. There would be a constitutional commission that oversees the calling of the convention, as well as oversees the education process. And the commission could be composed of, it's been suggested, perhaps university presidents or judges. They're basically going to be overseeing just the calling of it, and they would select 3 people who would be candidates to be basically the president of the convention, a non-voting president whose job is pretty much to oversee the administration of this convention as well as the education of the convention delegates. And this person would then, these 3 candidates would be presented to the delegates themselves once the convention has been created, and they would select from these 3 candidates for their own president to oversee the administration and election of the delegates. Then this president would have the ability to hire a person who is going to search all over to get the information that needs to be presented to these delegates, bringing in experts from different fields, people such as yourself, who would be able to address this convention and give them the benefits of your experience and knowledge and wisdom. And so this is, the types of things, the types of details that are being discussed right now, and if people have ideas, now's a great time to put them forward. Because we are concerned that it not be captured by any particular interest. You really do have to think these things through to make sure that doesn't happen. You have to have a conflict of interest, a code of ethics that they have to abide by, and all these sorts of things to make sure that this is going to be a fair and open process and produce a result that really excites California.
One of the things that I think is very interesting is that, when we say, that we'd have a convention body that would have Californians just like us, that may be true for some people in the room, but actually, to a certain extent, these proposals are for us to have a convention that doesn't look like us, the people in these rooms. So it's a very sort of magnanimous, way to go about doing this, really in a certain way. Kim?
I've been working on implementation of Prop 11, the redistricting reform initiative, and we weren't involved in drafting it or campaigning for it, but now that we're going to have